Imagine finding an ancient, mysterious stone that has the power to change the course of history. But at what cost? Meryl Streep's world is turned upside down when a strange package arrives at her doorstep, one that holds the key to unimaginable power. As she's drawn deeper into a world of secret societies and relentless pursuers, Meryl must decide. Will she wield the stone's incredible power, or will it consume her? As the stakes rise and the danger escalates, Meryl must face the ultimate choice, one that could alter everything she knows. But when the final twist hits, you won't believe what happens next. Stick around to the end because this story is just beginning. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft golden glow across the suburban neighborhood. It was one of those rare evenings when the world seemed to slow down, as if time itself wanted to take a breath. Meryl Streep, having just finished a long day on set, stepped out of her car, her feet clicking against the concrete driveway. The cool evening air tugged gently at her hair, the breeze carrying a hint of autumn's chill. She exhaled deeply, the kind of tired sigh that only comes after a day of intense work. It felt good to be home. Her house, nestled among trees that lined the quiet street, was a refuge from the chaos of Hollywood. It was a place where she could unwind, read a book, or simply stare out the window at the sky as the stars began to twinkle. But tonight, as she walked up the path toward her door, something felt off. She paused for a moment, her senses heightened. In the dim glow of the porch light, she spotted something unusual. Sitting there on her doorstep, perfectly placed at the edge of the welcome mat, was a small, unmarked package. No label. No return address. Just a plain brown box, the kind you might find in any warehouse, wrapped tightly in dull brown paper. Its presence struck her immediately as out of place. Every package she received, whether from friends or family, had some sort of identifying mark. But this was different. No letter. No sign of a sender. The chill in the evening air seemed to intensify, or maybe it was just the feeling creeping up her spine. Meryl stood frozen for a second, eyes narrowing as she scanned the surroundings. Nothing seemed amiss. Her neighbors' houses were dark, a car passed in the distance, and the usual quiet hum of the suburban night was all around. But the box was there, just waiting. She looked around again, more intently this time. Was it a gift? A surprise from one of her friends? Or perhaps a mistake from the delivery service? Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. Meryl hadn't ordered anything recently, and she certainly hadn't received any word from family or acquaintances about sending something her way. The longer she stood there, the more uneasy she became. She tried to shake off the growing sense of discomfort gnawing at her. But the box, it didn't belong. Not here, and certainly not now. The wind brushed against her face once again, sending a shiver down her spine. A wave of uncertainty washed over her. What if it wasn't for her at all? What if it was for someone else and had simply ended up at her doorstep by mistake? Still, something about the entire situation didn't sit right. She couldn't let it go. She needed to know what it was, what it meant. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, Meryl reached down. Her fingers brushed against the cold cardboard. They trembled slightly, a mixture of caution and curiosity. It felt as though the box was waiting for her touch, beckoning her forward. For a brief moment, she hesitated, almost second-guessing herself, but her curiosity won out. She scooped it up, feeling its surprising weight in her hands. Her mind raced with questions. Who would send such a mysterious package? Why leave it at her doorstep of all places? As she stepped inside her house, the weight of the box in her hands felt heavier than it had outside, as if it had absorbed something from the cold night air. She closed the door behind her, the click of the lock louder than usual. The house felt more silent than she remembered, almost as if it was holding its breath too. She could feel the faint buzzing energy in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Meryl Streep wondered if the world outside had just shifted. Her evening, once calm and peaceful, now seemed somehow different. Once inside, Meryl set the box down gently on her coffee table, the surface cold and sterile beneath it. The room, usually warm and inviting, seemed oddly still tonight. The tick of the wall clock sounded louder than usual, almost like a reminder of the silence that surrounded her. As she stood over the box, the quiet only deepened the mystery of its presence. The weight of it seemed disproportionate, like a silent promise, heavy with unanswered questions. Meryl's gaze lingered on the box as she ran her fingers along its surface. It was so plain, so ordinary on the outside, no labels, no stamps, no markings of any kind. It was almost as if it had appeared out of thin air, with no origin to trace, no one to claim it. She tried to recall any recent deliveries, anything she might have forgotten about, but nothing came to mind. Her fingers traced the edges of the box, and the strange unease that had followed her since she first saw it outside her door intensified. A creeping chill started to climb her spine, like an unseen presence was watching her. Meryl shook off the feeling, brushing it aside as she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank, some odd, elaborate joke from one of her colleagues. Or maybe a gift from a fan, though the absence of any message made it seem unlikely. Perhaps it was all just a setup for a role in a new movie, some sort of stunt to fuel curiosity. But none of these explanations felt satisfying. Something about the package didn't sit right with her. With a deep breath, Meryl stood up and walked to the kitchen. The familiar hum of her refrigerator and the soft clink of dishes from the nearby shelves made the house feel like it was its usual self again, but the package still sat there, waiting. She opened a drawer and grabbed a small, sharp knife, just the right tool to peel back the mystery. Holding the knife in her hand, she felt a strange reluctance. It was almost as if the box didn't want to be opened. Still, the desire to uncover what was inside overpowered her hesitation. She returned to the table, knife in hand, and slowly started cutting through the tape. The sound of the blade against the cardboard was oddly loud, as if the box was resisting, unwilling to give up its secrets. Her hands trembled slightly, though she couldn't explain why. It was just a package after all. But as the tape pulled away, a strange weight hung in the air, thick with anticipation. The box creaked open, its contents hidden from view. Inside, nestled in the darkness of the box, was something unexpected. An ornate, velvet-wrapped item, the cloth rich and soft to the touch. Meryl's heart skipped a beat, the air suddenly feeling charged with an energy she couldn't place. The velvet was dark, almost black, but it shimmered in the dim light of the room, giving off a faint glow as though it was something precious, or something forbidden. Her breath caught in her throat as she hesitated for a moment, staring down at the cloth. She could feel her pulse quickening, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. What was it? Who would send her something so mysterious, so personal? Was it a sign, a warning, or just an elaborate ruse? With a deep breath, Meryl lifted the cloth carefully, the weight of the moment making her every movement feel deliberate. She unwrapped it slowly, almost reverently, as though whatever lay inside might change everything. The cloth fell away to reveal an intricately carved box, its edges worn and faded with age. It looked old, very old, and yet there was something strikingly beautiful about it. The carvings were delicate, swirling patterns that seemed to move and shift when she looked at them, like they were alive. The box was made of dark wood, polished to a deep, rich luster that reflected the dim light of the room. It was heavy in her hands, far more substantial than she expected. She traced the edges of the carving with her fingers, noticing how each line seemed purposeful, as if it were telling a story, one that she was meant to hear. Meryl's mind swirled with questions. She could feel her heart beating faster now, the sensation of something larger than herself at play. She set the box down gently on the table, reluctant to open it further, yet knowing she couldn't stop herself. The air in the room felt thicker, charged with a strange energy that prickled her skin. This wasn't just a box, it was a key to something hidden in the shadows. And Meryl knew that whatever lay inside would change her life forever. As Meryl set the ornate box back down on the coffee table, she noticed something tucked underneath it, a folded piece of paper. It was simple, the edges creased and slightly yellowed with age. For a moment, she just stared at it, as though it might somehow reveal its meaning before she even opened it. The paper seemed so out of place, so ordinary compared to the intricacy of the box. And yet, Meryl couldn't shake the feeling that it was just as important. Her fingers hesitated for a moment as she reached out to pick it up, the same odd reluctance she'd felt when she first touched the box now magnified. It was almost as if the note was part of something much bigger, a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But she couldn't resist. With a deep breath, she unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the words written in a sharp, neat hand. The message was brief, but it struck her like a lightning bolt. The key to your future lies within. But only if you dare. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating in the silent room. Meryl read them again and again as if the meaning would suddenly become clear, but it didn't. In fact, it only left her more confused. The key to her future? What did that even mean? And what exactly did she have to dare? The sense of unease grew, its weight pressing down on her chest. The warning, if you dare, seemed almost too ominous to ignore. Who had written this note? And why had they sent it to her, of all people? 1,000 thoughts spiraled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Meryl scanned the paper again, But there were no other clues, no other hints that could explain its meaning. The message felt like a riddle, its true meaning just out of reach. It didn't make sense. The note offered no explanation, no hint of who had sent the package or why it was addressed to her. It was like a message meant for someone else, someone with the courage or knowledge to understand its significance. The weight of the note in her hands felt heavier now, as though the words themselves were burdening her with an unknowable responsibility. But still, the strange feeling of being watched lingered in the air. It was as if the walls around her were closing in, making it harder to breathe. As she continued to stare at the paper, an unsettling thought crossed her mind. What if this package wasn't just meant for her? What if it was a test? A test to see if she could understand it, solve it, unlock whatever secret lay within the box? Or worse, what if it was a warning, one that she wasn't supposed to ignore? The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. Was someone watching her, waiting to see what she would do with the stone, the box, the note? Had she been chosen for something? Or was this just the beginning of something far more dangerous than she could imagine? Meryl shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She was overthinking this. It was just a note, just a strange, cryptic note. But the more she looked at it, the more she felt that something larger was at play. The words, the box, the stone, they were all tied together in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. The future? What future? Could it really be hers, or was she simply a pawn in someone else's game? With a deep breath, she set the note down beside the box. She wasn't sure what to do next. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but deep down, a strange curiosity kept pulling her forward. Whatever this was, it was something she had to understand, something that had been placed in her hands for a reason. And despite the warning, despite the fear, she knew she had no choice but to keep going. Meryl shook off the lingering unease that still clung to the air around her, refocusing on the box in front of her. The carvings on its surface were unlike anything she had ever seen, delicate, almost otherworldly. As her fingers traced the intricate designs, she swore the patterns shifted slightly, as though the box itself was reacting to her touch. There was a subtle pulsation, a slight vibration, a faint hum that seemed to come from deep within the wood. It was as if the box was alive, alive in a way that felt ancient and full of power, as though it had been waiting for her, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Her heart raced with both fear and fascination. The cryptic note, the glowing stone, it was all becoming too much to ignore. Every instinct in her screamed to stop, to turn away, to leave the box closed and forgotten. But Meryl's curiosity outweighed her fear. She had to know what lay inside. She had to understand. With trembling hands, Meryl carefully lifted the lid of the antique box. It creaked softly as if the hinges hadn't been moved in centuries. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft, rich velvet, lay a small stone. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, but as she leaned in closer, her breath caught. The stone was glowing, faintly but unmistakably. It emitted a soft, ethereal light, casting long, strange shadows across the table. The glow wasn't from any ordinary light source, and the more she stared at it, the more entrancing it became. The stone seemed almost alive, pulsing gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. It was as if it had a life of its own, a presence that tugged at her very soul. Meryl reached out slowly, her fingers hovering above the stone. She felt a strange, almost magnetic pull, urging her to pick it up, to hold it. She resisted for a moment, but the pull was irresistible. As her fingers brushed against the stone, a shock of warmth surged through her hand, like a static charge from the air. The stone was warm, uncomfortably warm, like it had been sitting in the sun for hours. But it didn't burn her. Instead, it radiated a gentle energy, a hum that vibrated through her fingertips. She lifted the stone into her hand, feeling a tingling sensation spread up her arm, and an unsettling thrill ran through her chest. For a moment, Meryl felt as though time had stopped. The room seemed to shimmer, its edges blurring as though reality itself was becoming uncertain. A deep, unsettling hum filled the space around her, a sound she couldn't place, soft, distant, like a whisper just beyond her hearing. The lights flickered above her, casting long shadows across the room, as if the very air had grown charged with something dangerous, something ancient. Meryl's breath caught in her throat. She thought she had heard a whisper, faint and distant, like someone calling her name, or was it something else, something far more sinister? It was impossible to tell, the sound so faint, so delicate, that she couldn't be sure it wasn't just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then she felt it, the air around her seemed to shift, distort. The walls of the room appeared to pulse, as though the space itself were bending and warping under the weight of the stone's presence. Meryl's chest tightened, a strange pressure building inside her as though the world itself was holding its breath. The stone was alive, it was calling to her, but why? A cold shiver ran down her spine as the whispers grew louder, or perhaps clearer. It was no longer just in her mind. She could feel the stone's power wrapping around her, pulling at her, urging her to listen, to understand. Meryl took a step back, her grip tightening around the stone. It felt heavier now, more real, as though it had taken on a life of its own. The strange sensation in her chest was undeniable, as though something deep inside her was awakening. And that's when she realized, it wasn't just the stone that was calling to her. It was something else, something far more profound, far more ancient than she could have ever imagined. The stone was a gateway. The room shifted again, and for a fleeting moment, Meryl saw a vision flash before her eyes. It was so fast, so jumbled, that she could barely make sense of it. There were glimpses of other places, other times perhaps, of people she didn't recognize, speaking in strange tongues, performing rituals she didn't understand. It was overwhelming, dizzying. Before she could make sense of it, the vision was gone. The room was still. But the stone in her hand pulsed once more, and the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. Meryl stood frozen, heart racing, her thoughts a chaotic whirl. The stone had power, undeniable, ancient power. And whatever it was meant for, it had chosen her. The moment the stone's energy surged through Meryl, everything around her went blurry. The room, the walls, the floor beneath her feet, everything seemed to ripple and fade like the edges of a dream. The air turned thick with an unnatural stillness, and Meryl felt herself losing her grip on reality. She stumbled back, trying to steady herself, but the ground beneath her shifted as if she were standing on the edge of an abyss. The world seemed to tilt and warp, and for an instant she wasn't sure if she was still in her living room or somewhere else entirely. Then it happened. In an instant, Meryl was bombarded with visions. They came in rapid, fragmented flashes, so fast, so vivid she couldn't process them all at once. She saw her childhood home, the familiar house where she had grown up. It was warm and comforting, the smell of her mother's cooking filling the air. She could hear the laughter of her family, faces she hadn't thought about in years, faces she longed to see again. Her heart swelled with a mixture of love and longing. It was a beautiful memory, but it was fleeting. Before she could fully grasp the warmth of the moment, the visions shifted. The comforting images blurred into something darker. Meryl found herself in unfamiliar places, strange landscapes that felt both alien and oddly familiar, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. She was surrounded by people she didn't recognize, faces too distorted to make out, figures whose eyes were filled with desperation. Some of these strangers were in grave danger, trapped in situations she couldn't quite understand. She saw a woman running through a darkened alley, her face twisted in fear as if someone was after her. A man was tied to a chair, blood staining his clothes, his mouth silenced with a gag. A child stood at the edge of a cliff, staring out at a stormy sea, trembling as if waiting for something, or someone. Meryl couldn't make sense of the images. They were all connected by a thread of urgency, of terror, but she couldn't see how. Then another flash, a face. A man, tall and shadowed, appeared in front of her. His features were obscured by darkness, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling certainty. He smiled at her, the expression not one of kindness but of knowing. His lips curved in a sinister way, and the longer she stared, the more Meryl felt her skin crawl. His eyes were piercing, hollow yet burning with an unspoken promise, an ominous sense of something to come. For a split second, Meryl's heart stopped. It was as though the man was not just looking at her, but through her, seeing something deep inside her that she didn't even fully understand. The smile he gave her felt like a warning, like a challenge, like he knew what was coming, and he expected her to play her part. "Who are you?" she tried to ask, but no words came out. Her mouth was dry, and the vision of the man faded before she could reach out to him. His smile lingered, burning into her mind. The visions shifted again, but this time they came in a blur, a rush of moments and faces so chaotic that Meryl couldn't make sense of them. She saw flashes of herself, but they were distorted, her movements jerky like scenes in an old film reel, flickering in and out of focus. In one, she was standing in a crowded place holding the stone, but her hands were trembling, her face pale and fearful. In another, she was in a dark room, surrounded by people, but she wasn't sure if they were friends or enemies. Each image was fleeting, leaving her with more questions than answers. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the vision stopped. Meryl gasped for breath, her chest heaving as the world around her snapped back into focus. The room was still, the walls no longer warping and shifting. She was back in her living room, standing over the box and the stone, her fingers still tingling from the energy she had just felt. But the haunting images lingered, each one sharp in her memory, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. She didn't know if she could trust what she had seen. Were they just side effects of the stone's power, manifestations of her own mind unraveling under its influence? Or were they glimpses into the future? Into a future that had already started to unfold? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She had no answers, only more questions. The stone, the visions, the strange man with the knowing grin, it was all too much to make sense of. But one thing was certain, the future was coming and she couldn't ignore it. As Meryl tried to steady her breath, she realized that whatever path lay ahead, it was no longer just about her. The people she had seen, the strangers, the child, the man, were all connected to her in ways she couldn't yet understand. And the stone, this mysterious object that had chosen her, held the key to something far larger than she could comprehend. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming. But she knew that whatever it was, it would find her, whether she was prepared or not. Meryl awoke the next morning, her mind still reeling from the visions of the previous night. The images, the faces, the places, the cryptic man with the knowing smile, they clung to her like shadows, impossible to shake off. She tried to convince herself that it was just a side effect of the stone's power, that it was all in her head. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. What she had experienced felt real, too real. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The stone wasn't just an object of power, it was a key to something much bigger. As she sat at her kitchen table trying to process everything, there was a sudden knock at the door. The sound was sharp, unexpected, and it jolted her from her thoughts. She glanced toward the door, her heart racing. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock came with an urgency that made her pulse quicken. Hesitant, Meryl stood up and walked to the door. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but when she opened it, she certainly wasn't prepared for the man standing on her doorstep. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features that seemed almost too perfect, as if he belonged to another time. His eyes were calm, but there was an intensity in them, something ancient and knowing, like he had seen far more of the world than Meryl could ever imagine. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, a sense of purpose that made Meryl's unease grow. "I see you found it," the man said, his voice smooth and firm but not unkind. "The stone. You don't know what you've unleashed." Meryl's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her chest tightening with a mixture of confusion and fear. How did he know about the stone? The visions had been so overwhelming, so private. She hadn't told anyone about them. She hadn't even begun to understand what was happening to her, let alone talk about it. But this man he knew. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't know if she should trust him, but something about him seemed too familiar, too certain. The man gave her a knowing smile, as if he had been expecting this question. "My name is David," he said. "And I've been watching you for a while." "Watching me?" Meryl repeated, her heart hammering in her chest. "Why? And why are you here?" David's gaze softened, but there was an intensity to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "The stone you found isn't just a trinket," he explained, stepping forward with a deliberate slowness, as if he understood the gravity of his words. "It's an ancient artifact tied to forces beyond your understanding. It has the power to alter the course of history, your history and the history of others." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. "It has chosen you," David said. His voice was steady, almost comforting, but the implication of his words hung in the air like a cloud. "Though you haven't been the first to hold it. The stone has a long history, a history of those who have sought it, those who have used it, and those who have been consumed by it." Meryl felt her stomach drop. She stepped back again, eyes wide with disbelief. "Chosen me? I don't even understand what this thing is." She motioned toward the box on the table, where the stone now lay, dormant but still radiating an eerie energy. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this." David's gaze softened again, though his eyes still held that distant knowledge, as if he knew exactly what she was going through. "No one ever asks for the stone," he said gently. "But once it chooses you, there's no turning back. It has a will of its own, and it will shape your future whether you understand it or not." Meryl felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "I don't want it. I don't want any part of this. How do I make it stop?" David took a deep breath, as though preparing to explain something that might be too much for her to understand. "You can't stop it," he said quietly. "The stone has a purpose, and it's already set events in motion. But you're not alone. There are others who have carried the stone before you. Some succeeded in using its power for good. Others didn't. The path you take is yours to decide, but you must understand, this isn't just about you anymore. Meryl's mind was spinning, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She couldn't fathom the idea that this stone, this mysterious object she had stumbled upon, could have such power. How had it found its way to her? Why had it chosen her? David's eyes held hers with a steady, unwavering gaze. The stone is part of a much larger story, Meryl. A story that stretches back centuries. And now you're part of it. What happens next will depend on what you do with it. But be warned, the stone will test you. It will push you to your limits. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. And what if I fail? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's smile was both kind and sorrowful. Then you'll join the others who failed. And the stone will move on as it always does. For a moment, Meryl felt the weight of his words press down on her, her future now hanging in the balance of this ancient, mysterious object. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the world was waiting for her next move. David turned to leave but then paused at the door. I'll be in touch, he said. You'll need guidance. And you'll need allies. You won't be able to do this alone. And just like that he was gone. Meryl stood there, staring at the door, her mind racing. What had just happened? Who was this man? And what did all of this mean for her? The stone lay before her, glowing faintly, its power still a mystery. She knew one thing for sure now, her life had changed forever. And there was no going back. As the days passed, Meryl found herself increasingly unsettled. The heavy feeling that she was being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. At first, it was subtle, fleeting glances from strangers, the way people seemed to linger just a little too long when she walked past. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Strange figures appeared on the streets, always out of the corner of her eye, vanishing as soon as she looked directly at them. She'd catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of her vision, only to turn around and find the street empty. Meryl tried to brush it off, telling herself she was just paranoid, that the stone and everything that had happened with it had been too overwhelming. But the feeling of eyes on her never disappeared. It was like the world had shifted, and she was now the center of a silent, invisible watch. Her phone, once a comforting source of connection to the outside world, became a source of dread. At first it was just odd, texts and calls from numbers she didn't recognize, cryptic messages that made no sense. The messages started innocently enough. The stone cannot be controlled, you don't understand the power you hold. But then they grew darker. You are not safe. They are coming for you. What happens when the stone is taken from you? The worst ones came late at night, sending cold shivers down her spine. I know where you are, and the one that haunted her the most. Run? Her first instinct was to ignore them. Maybe it was just someone playing a cruel prank, but the more she tried to forget, the more the sense of danger grew. It wasn't just the messages though. There were other signs, strange cars parked outside her house, people loitering in her neighborhood who didn't seem to belong. And every time she stepped outside, the feeling of being followed intensified. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know who to trust or what to do. David remained by her side, his presence a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos. But even he couldn't seem to fully ease her fear. His calm, measured demeanor did little to calm the rising panic inside her. The more he explained, the more confusing it became. The stone, it seemed, was part of something far larger, something that spanned centuries. An artifact coveted by many, and one that had already caused a great deal of pain. David told her stories of the others who had come before her. The ones who had sought the stone, who had tried to use its power for their own purposes. Some had been able to control it, but others had fallen, consumed by its power or lost to those who sought to control the stone. He spoke of organizations, secret groups, and forces that would do anything to possess the stone's power. It's not just a gift, Meryl, he said one night, his voice grim. It's a weapon. And there are those who will stop at nothing to wield it. As the days went on, it became increasingly clear that the danger wasn't just theoretical. Meryl's phone kept buzzing with cryptic messages, some from untraceable numbers, others from people she didn't recognize, telling her to leave the stone behind or run while you can. It was becoming impossible to tell who was on her side, and who was out to get the stone for themselves. And then one afternoon it happened. Meryl was walking home from the grocery store when she saw him. A man standing at the corner of her street, watching her intently. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. But it wasn't just his presence that alarmed her. It was the way he looked at her, like he knew exactly who she was, like he'd been waiting for her. Her heart began to race as she quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. She reached her front door and slammed it shut behind her, locking it with trembling hands. But the sense of unease didn't disappear. It only intensified. She was being hunted. David had warned her, but now it felt like it was too late to run. Whoever was chasing her was getting closer, and the stone, the power it contained, it was the reason they were coming. They didn't want her. They wanted the stone. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Meryl picked it up with shaking hands, knowing before she even answered who it would be. "You need to leave," David's voice came through, low and urgent. "They're here. They found you." Before Meryl could respond, a knock came at her door. 3 short, measured taps. Her heart froze in her chest. They were here. Whoever they were. David's voice cracked through the line again, barely audible now. "Meryl, listen to me. You have to get out of there. Trust no one. And don't stop running." The door rattled slightly as if someone was testing it. Meryl moved quickly, grabbing the stone and slipping it into her pocket. She glanced out the window, seeing the same dark figure from earlier, this time standing closer, almost at her doorstep. Her mind raced. What were they going to do to her? Why hadn't she listened sooner? She should have left, she should have been prepared, but there was no time for regrets. The pursuit had begun, and the only choice she had now was to run. The pounding of Meryl's heart was the only sound that accompanied her hurried footsteps as she ducked into a dimly lit room. The shadows seemed to envelop her, but the small, flickering light from a solitary lamp cast an eerie glow on the walls, making them stretch and shudder in the darkness. Meryl felt as though she were walking through a dream, disconnected from reality, but painfully aware of the danger creeping ever closer. David was already there, waiting. His face was more serious than Meryl had ever seen it. There was no comfort in his usual calm demeanor now, just a deep, unspoken understanding of what was at stake. He motioned for her to sit, and Meryl did so without hesitation. The weight of everything, the stone, the pursuit, the cryptic messages, was crushing her. She needed answers more than anything, and David was the only one who seemed to have any idea of what was really going on. "Tell me everything," Meryl whispered, her voice hoarse from the strain of fear and confusion. David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He leaned forward, his tone low and serious. "The stone isn't just an artifact, Meryl. It's far more than that. It's a key to unlocking an ancient secret, one that could change the course of history itself." Meryl's mind raced as she tried to process his words. She had already known that the stone was powerful, but this was something else entirely. "What do you mean? What secret?" David's gaze grew distant, like he was recalling a time long past. For centuries, secret societies and powerful organizations have been searching for the stone, each hoping to wield its power for their own gain. But the stone doesn't just give power, it tests you. It chooses the one who is worthy to carry its burden. And now, Meryl, it has chosen you. Meryl's breath caught in her throat. "Me? But why? I didn't ask for this. I don't even understand it." David's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them, only understanding. The stone is not meant for everyone. It chooses those with the strength to wield it, those who can handle the responsibility. But that comes at a great cost. Meryl felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean, a cost?" David's voice lowered even more, almost a whisper. "The stone has the ability to alter time, to shape the future. It can unravel the very fabric of reality itself. You've felt its power, haven't you? The visions, the sense that time and space are shifting around you. That's the stone, Meryl. And once you accept it, there's no going back." Meryl's mind spun. She had been warned, she had felt the power coursing through her, but she hadn't understood the true weight of it until now. Time, the future, reality, it was all too much to comprehend. She had only wanted answers, not the power to change everything. But now she knew, the stone had found her for a reason, and that reason was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. "What happens if I can't control it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the words heavy with dread. David's gaze hardened, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "If you can't control it, Meryl, it will consume you. The stone will take everything from you, the past, the present, the future. And it won't stop until it's reshaped the world according to its will." Her breath caught in her throat. She had already seen what the stone could do to her mind, how it had twisted her reality with visions of strange places and people. What would it do if she couldn't control it? David leaned back, his expression grim. "But that doesn't mean you're powerless. You still have a choice. The stone has chosen you, but you can refuse it. You can walk away, leave it behind, and let those who have been searching for it take control. Or He trailed off, the weight of the decision settling over them both. Or, Meryl asked, the word hanging in the air between them. Or you can choose to embrace its power, David said quietly. You can learn to wield it, learn to control it. But it will not be easy. The stone will test you. It will push you to your limits, forcing you to make choices that will shape not only your life but the lives of everyone around you. Meryl's mind was reeling. She had no idea what it meant to control such power, to hold the future in her hands. But what choice did she have? She had already felt the pull of the stone, its weight in her pocket. She had seen the visions, and she knew that whatever was happening was far beyond her understanding. But the idea of walking away, of abandoning the stone, seemed impossible. She couldn't just run, she had to face this. For better or for worse, she had already stepped into something far larger than herself. Can I really control it? She asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. Can anyone? David's expression softened, but there was still a hardness to his words. The stone has chosen you, Meryl. That means you have the strength to wield it, but it's not a simple task. The power it holds is ancient, and the forces that are after it are not the only ones who will try to control it. You will face challenges that you cannot even imagine. Meryl closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The stone had already begun to change her life, to pull her into something far beyond her control. But the thought of losing herself to it, of becoming something she couldn't understand, was terrifying. Still, she knew that she couldn't let go, not now. She opened her eyes and met David's gaze, a new resolve settling in her chest. I'm ready, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I have to be. Whatever happens, I'll face it. David nodded slowly, his expression softening with approval. Then you must prepare. The road ahead won't be easy, but you're not alone. I'll help you as much as I can. But know this, once you accept the stone's power, there's no turning back. Meryl looked down at the stone, resting quietly in her hand. She didn't fully understand it. She didn't fully understand what she had gotten herself into. But one thing was clear, her life, her future had already been changed. The stone had chosen her, and now she had to choose to face whatever came next. Meryl stood in the middle of her dimly lit apartment, her body rigid with tension, her heart thundering in her chest. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. The stone, now resting cold and solid in her hand, was both a lifeline and a curse. She had reached a crossroads, a moment of decision that would define the rest of her life. The strange men and women who had been following her for weeks, shadowing her every move, were closing in. She could hear them, their whispers just beyond her door, their footsteps echoing in the hall. They had finally found her, and they wanted what she had, the stone. They had made their intentions clear. They had threatened her, manipulated her, all in an attempt to force her into surrendering the stone. The cold, calculating figures who had followed her were relentless. They knew what the stone could do, and they would stop at nothing to possess its power. She could almost hear their cold voices in her mind. Hand it over and we'll let you live. But Meryl knew better than to believe their lies. She had seen the way they operated, the way they destroyed those who stood in their way. If she handed the stone over, she would be just another pawn in their game, another lost soul, consumed by the very power they sought to control. Her options were narrowing. She could surrender, save herself for a time perhaps. But what would that really mean? The stone's power would be turned against the world, used to manipulate, to twist, to destroy. That was a future she couldn't accept. Or she could fight. She could use the stone's power against them. She could fight back, unleash the power it contained and take control of her destiny. But the cost of such a choice was unknown, and the stone's power was not something she fully understood. Could she wield it without losing herself? Would the stone consume her, warp her mind as it had already begun to do? The power was intoxicating, dangerous, too dangerous to take lightly. She glanced at the stone in her hand, its glowing light pulsating softly, as if it were calling to her, urging her to make a choice. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. She could feel the energy coursing through her, the force of the stone pulling at her very soul, as if it were testing her resolve. The agents were at her door now, their footsteps growing louder. They had no idea what she was capable of, what she could do with the stone. But Meryl knew one thing for certain, she was out of time. She raised the stone high above her head. For a moment, the room seemed to darken, the air thickening as though the very fabric of reality were being stretched. A surge of energy rushed through her body, like a lightning bolt ripping through her veins. The stone began to hum, vibrating with an intensity that shook her to her core. The power, so raw, so pure, flooded her senses, warping everything around her. The energy was too much to control. Her mind began to fray at the edges, her thoughts scattered, torn apart by the overwhelming surge of power. It was as if the stone had taken over, guiding her every movement. The world around her shifted. Time seemed to bend and twist, the walls warping, the air thick with a heavy electric charge. She could feel the agents at the door, their presence now distorted as though they were miles away. Suddenly everything snapped. The stone's energy exploded outward in a wave of pure force, a shockwave that rattled the entire building. Meryl felt her feet lift off the ground as the energy hurled her backwards. The agents outside scrambled, their voices filled with panic, but their cries were lost in the chaotic rush of power. The stone was not just a weapon, it was a force of nature, a tool capable of reshaping the very world itself. And Meryl had just unleashed it. But the power was not without its consequences. As the energy surged, Meryl could feel herself being pulled into something dark and endless, a vortex of chaos that threatened to swallow her whole. The stone had given her power, but it had also taken something in return. Her mind spun wildly, thoughts tumbling through the storm like debris. She felt herself slipping, her sense of self becoming distant, as if she were losing herself to the stone's pull. The world around her fractured, the walls of her apartment dissolving into shadow, the agent's frantic attempts to break through the door now a distant echo. She was alone, standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. Meryl's chest tightened, the power of the stone overwhelming her. She could feel it draining her, pulling her deeper into the unknown. It was as if the stone itself was feeding on her, absorbing her essence, twisting her into something unrecognizable. She had chosen to fight, to wield the stone's power, but now she wasn't sure if she could hold on. A part of her, deep inside where her true self still lingered, knew she couldn't stop now. The stone had changed her. It had irrevocably altered her future. But was she strong enough to control it? To use it without losing herself entirely? The vortex closed in around her, and Meryl felt a strange peace amidst the chaos. She had made her choice. The path ahead was uncertain, but she had no other option but to face it. Meryl's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding as the stone's energy continued to surge through her. The power coursed through her veins, both exhilarating and terrifying. Her body trembled under its weight, and her mind teetered on the brink of collapse. The room around her was alive with energy, warping and shifting as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The stone's light grew brighter, more intense, until it was all-consuming. The hum of its power filled her ears, a low, constant buzz that resonated deep in her chest. Meryl could feel herself slipping, her grasp on reality loosening with every passing second. The power was too much. It was overwhelming, suffocating, pulling her deeper into something she couldn't control. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room growing hazy. The walls of her apartment seemed to dissolve, the colors bleeding together into a swirling vortex. She reached out, trying to steady herself, but her body felt unmoored, like she was floating through an endless void. The stone was both a part of her and something entirely outside of her, something that was taking over her very essence. Then, through the distortion, Meryl saw him. A figure standing in the shadows. His silhouette was barely visible, but there was no mistaking his presence. His eyes, cold, unblinking and full of dark knowledge, locked onto hers. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of inevitability in the way he stared at her, like he had been waiting for this moment, for her to lose herself to the stone's power. Meryl tried to call out, to scream, to do something, but her voice was lost in the chaos swirling around her. The figure stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression unreadable. He was there watching her, but it was clear he wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the story, part of the game Meryl had been unwillingly drawn into. The stone pulsed again, brighter this time, and Meryl felt her grip on her own body slip even further. She was no longer in control. The stone had taken over, its power, its force, its will, everything she was had been absorbed into the glow. She could feel herself fading, becoming a part of the energy itself. And then, just as the darkness closed in around her, the world went black. Silence. The hum of the stone, the chaos in her mind, the cold figure in the shadows. Everything disappeared into nothingness. There was no sound, no movement, no sense of time or space. Meryl was suspended in an eternal void, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like 1,000 tons. Had she succeeded in wielding the stone's power? Or had it already consumed her body and soul? The questions hung in the air, unanswered as the screen remained black. Would Meryl be able to control the stone's immense power, or was she doomed to become another lost soul, consumed by the very force she had tried to master? The answer was still unknown. And with that, the story was left hanging, a cliffhanger that left the audience on the edge of their seats, wondering what would happen next.